So far, we've been looking at plain HTML documents. As you recall, HTML was originally developed as a way to structure documents that were going to be shared for scientific and other serious purposes. Because of that, there was no reason to worry about what they looked like. As long as the information was presented in a way that was properly structured and easily grasped, the job was done. But as the internet became more popular, and especially as the web came along, all sorts of other users were interested in the web. And at that point, design of web pages became a more important factor. But there just wasn't anything built into HTML to let us make a decent design. That doesn't mean that there weren't attempts at designing, but they had more downs than they had ups. By using things like tables in HTML in the mid to late 1990s, we saw websites pop up that look like this. Now you can see, even with the resources of a major motion picture studio, Warner Brothers, or with the resources of CNN with the OJ trial, they didn't really look that great. And the other problem was that by using things from HTML that were not designed for design, that caused problems. There were loads of competing browsers available in those days, and if you designed something that looked okay in Internet Explorer, for instance, it probably wouldn't look okay in any other browser out there. So there had to be a rethink of this. And fortunately, by the late 1990s already, something came along, and it was something called Cascading Style Sheets. So the idea with Cascading Style Sheets was that we were going to take and the HTML we used, and pretty straightforward here, what we've been working on, we were going to actually be able to design HTML elements in it. So anything in the body section, we could say H1s need to look like this, and paragraphs need to look like this, and lists need to look like that, and on and on and on. And it gave us so much flexibility, at least in theory, that we could design pages that looked really good. We could change typefaces, we could change point size, we could change colors, we could change underlining, we could do all sorts of things. But the birth of CSS was not without some pains, because again, there were a lot of browsers available. Some of them were compliant with the CSS specifications, some of them weren't. So it did take a long time before CSS finally became pretty much universal. But the wait was worth it, because not only was CSS something that then became widely used for design, but CSS kept growing, and we can now do so much with CSS, creating multiple columns and rows, creating animations, placing things that stay stationary as you scroll through a page. It's an amazing amount of stuff that we can do. And there's almost nothing that we need to learn about HTML that we don't know already to make CSS work. And CSS itself, for the most part, the basic stuff's pretty easy. It's not exactly like HTML, but it is another markup language. We're not into coding yet. The coding only comes when you get into something like JavaScript, and that's a long ways off from where we are. So the first thing we need to think about is, where do the instructions go for styling the HTML elements? And there are actually three ways we can do that. One way is to put them in a style section up in the head section of a document. Perfectly fine. Another way is actually embedding style in the document itself. There are some cases where that's perfectly fine. But the one that has the most power is creating a separate document that we put all the CSS information in and connecting that to our HTML document. So we're going to wrap up this first video on the introduction of CSS just by looking at what we need to do in our HTML document to make it work with the CSS. Somehow this document needs to know there's another document that is going to give it instructions for how it should look. We want to make sure that when we create the CSS document, we're going to put it in the same folder as the HTML document. If we put it in another folder, for instance, a subfolder named CSS, we would need to specify that. But right now, we've got a pretty simple project, and we're just going to make things very simple. And so all we need to do is go up to the head section of our HTML document and paste in this line of code. We're basically saying this document should link to another document that's a style sheet, and the type of it is text/CSS, and the name of it is style.css. Why style.css? It could be any name as long as it ends in CSS. You call it Bob CSS or Mary CSS or Groundhog Day CSS. It just doesn't matter, but there should be a reason why you give it that name. But the convention is style.css. So at this point, that's all you need to do with your HTML document in order to let it find the CSS document and then start styling. In part 2, we're going to look at what actually goes in the CSS document.